What are the largest known volcanic eruptions in history?
Scientists measure volcanic eruptions by the amount of material that a volcano ejects into the atmosphere. Based on this measurement system, the largest eruptions include, in descending order of strength: 1 at Yellowstone Park in the United States, c. 600,000 BC, another at Toba, Indonesia. About 74,000 BC, Atambara, Indonesia, eruption in AD 1815, Santorini, Greece, in 1470 BC. Loki, Iceland, in AD 1783, which also produced the largest known lava flow in recorded history. And another in Indonesia, at Krakatau, in AD 1883. The eruption in Yellowstone is hard to fathom. The volcano, which would have been located in present-day Wyoming, left a crater that measures 30 by 45 miles and released about 10,000 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. To put this into perspective, consider that the next largest eruption, that at Toba, released 1/10 that amount, or 1,000 cubic kilometers. The one at Tambora released 1/10 of the Toba amount, 100 cubic kilometers. All of the others released about 10 cubic kilometers of earth debris into the atmosphere. The May 18, 1980, eruption of Mount St. Helens in southwestern Washington state is also considered among the largest known eruptions in history and is the largest eruption in the modern history of the 48 contiguous United States. Mount St. Helens released a comparatively small amount of material, 1 cubic kilometer, but the damage was great after the volcano erupted. Much of the region was blanketed in ash, miles of forest were devastated, and the North Fork of the Toutle River was laden with ash and other volcanic debris up to 600 feet deep. The eruption claimed 57 lives.
What is muckraking journalism?
Muckrakers are journalists who seek out and expose the misconduct of prominent people or of high-profile organizations. They emerged on the American scene in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Crusaders for social change, muckraking journalists wrote articles not about news events, but about injustices or abuses, bringing them to the attention of the American public. Published in newspapers and magazines, the articles exposed corruption in business and politics. While the early muckrakers were sometimes criticized for their tactics, their work succeeded in raising widespread awareness of social, economic, and political ills, prompting a number of reforms, including passage of pure food laws and antitrust legislation. American politician Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, dubbed the controversial journalists muckrakers, a reference to a character in Pilgrim's Progress. By English preacher John Bunyan 1628 to 1688, who rejects a crown for a muckrake, a tool used to rake dung.
What is the Protestant ethic?
The Protestant ethic is a term describing a set of attitudes fostered by the leaders of the Reformation. Martin Luther, 1483–1546, John Calvin, 1509–1564. John Knox, 1513–1572, Huldrych Zwingli, 1484–1531, Conrad Grebel, c. 1498–1526, and their Protestant successors such as Methodist Church founders John Wesley. 1703–1791, and Charles Wesley, 1707–1788. These church leaders stress the holiness of a person's daily life, the importance of pastors to lead family lives, versus the celibacy of Catholic monks and nuns, education and study, and personal responsibility. According to these beliefs, the person who is hardworking, thrifty, and honest is a good person of value to their community and to God. From 1904 to 1905, German sociologist Max Weber, 1864 to 1920, wrote an essay called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, asserting that Protestant principles contributed to the growth of industry and commerce during the 1700s and 1800s since the hard work, investment, and savings of individuals helped build a capitalist economy.
Were the Pilgrims explorers?
The Pilgrims were early settlers who sought religious freedom and self-government in the New World. Since theirs was a religious journey, they described themselves as pilgrims. In fact, they were separatists, Protestants who separated from the Anglican Church to set up their own church. In 1609 they fled their home in Screwby, England, and settled in Holland. Fearing their children would lose contact with their own culture, becoming assimilated into the Dutch culture, the group decided to voyage to America to establish their own community. In 1620 they arrived on the rocky western shore of Cape Cod Bay, Massachusetts. Their transatlantic crossing had taken 66 days aboard the Mayflower. 2 babies were born during the passage, bringing the number of settlers to 102, only some 35 of whom were pilgrims, the rest were merchants. On November 21 the Pilgrims drafted the Mayflower Compact, an agreement by which the 41 signatories, the men aboard the Mayflower, formed a body politic that was authorized to enact and enforce laws for the community. Religious leader John Carver, 1576–1621, was voted governor. Though their colonial charter from the London Company specified they were to settle in Virginia, they decided to establish their colony at Cape Cod, well outside the company's jurisdiction. By December 25 the Pilgrims had chosen the site for their settlement and began building at New Plymouth. The first year was difficult and the Pilgrims faced many hardships. 35 more colonists arrived aboard the Fortune, putting a strain on already limited resources. Sicknesses such as pneumonia, tuberculosis, and scurvy claimed many lives, including that of Governor Carver. And the merchants in the group challenged the purity of the settlement. Having secured a new patent from the Council of New England in June 1621. The lands of New Plymouth Colony were held in common by both the Pilgrims and the merchants. But this communal system of agriculture proved unsuccessful, and in 1624 William Bradford (1590 to 1657), who had succeeded Carver as governor, granted each family its own parcel of land. The Wampanoag Indians, who had previously occupied the land settled by the Pilgrims, proved friendly and were helpful advisors in agricultural matters. In 1626 the Pilgrims bought out the merchants' shares and claimed the colony for themselves. Though they were inexperienced at government before arriving in America and had not been formally educated, the Pilgrims successfully governed themselves according to the Scriptures. And Plymouth Colony remained independent until 1691, when it became part of Massachusetts Bay Colony founded by the Puritans.
What is NATO?
NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance formed on April 4, 1949, when 12 countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington, D.C. The original 12 NATO countries were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Each member nation agreed to treat attacks on any other member nation as if it were an attack on itself. In other words, any aggressor would have to face the entire alliance. This was NATO's policy of deterrence, a way of discouraging any attacks by the Soviet Union or other Eastern Bloc countries. The organization had the further benefit of discouraging fighting among the member countries. 3 years after it was formed, the alliance was joined by Greece and Turkey, in 1952. West Germany followed 3 years after that, in 1955, and Spain joined in 1982. After the fall of communism and the reunification of East and West Germany, c. 1990, all of Germany joined the alliance. At this point, with the Cold War, 1947–89, over, many wondered what purpose the organization could serve. After all, the Soviet threat was no longer existent. However, other conflicts loomed on the horizon, including those in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in the Albanian Republic of Kosovo. Fearing the civil war in the former Yugoslav Republic would spread, NATO sent in troops on the side of the Bosnian government. NATO also formed the Partnership for Peace in 1994. This program was joined by more than 20 countries, including former Eastern Bloc nations, including Russia. Though these nations are not full members in the NATO alliance, the Partnership for Peace provides for joint military planning among signing nations. On March 12, 1999, 3 former Eastern Bloc nations were given full membership in NATO: Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Observers hailed the additions as evidence that Europe is becoming more unified. On April 23, 1999, the 50th anniversary of the alliance's founding, the 19 NATO member nations gathered in Washington, D.C., to commemorate the event, just after NATO had begun air bombing Yugoslavia. To pressure the government there to accept international terms aimed at bringing peace to the nation's Kosovo province, where ethnic conflicts between Serbs and Albanians had turned deadly. NATO is governed by the North Atlantic Council, which is made up of the heads of government of member nations or their representatives. It was headquartered in Paris until 1967, at which time the offices were moved to Brussels, Belgium.
What is the Sherman Antitrust Act?
Passed by Congress in 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was an attempt to break up corporate trusts, combinations of firms or corporations formed to limit competition and monopolize a market. The legislation stated that every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in the restraint of trade is illegal. While the act made clear that anyone found to be in violation of restraining trade would face fines, jail terms, and the payment of damages, the language lacked clear definitions of what exactly constituted restraint of trade. The nation's courts were left with the responsibility of interpreting the Sherman Antitrust Act, and the justices proved as reluctant to take on big business as Congress had been. The legislation was introduced in Congress by Senator John Sherman, 1823-1900, of Ohio, in response to increasing outcry from state governments and the public for the passage of national antitrust laws. Many states had passed their own antitrust bills or had made constitutional provisions prohibiting trusts, but the statutes proved difficult to enforce and big business found ways around them. When the legislation proposed by Sherman reached the Senate, conservative congressmen rewrote it. Many charged that the senators had made it deliberately vague. In the decade after its passage, the federal government prosecuted only 18 antitrust cases, and court decisions did little to break up monopolies. But after the turn of the century, a progressive spirit in the nation grew. Among progressive reformers' demands was that government regulate business. In 1911 the U.S. Justice Department won key victories against monopolies, breaking up John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company of New Jersey and James B. Duke's American Tobacco Company. The decisions set a precedent for how the Sherman Antitrust Act would be enforced and demonstrated a national intolerance toward monopolistic trade practices. In 1914, national antitrust legislation was strengthened by the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act, which outlawed price fixing, the practice of pricing below cost to eliminate a competitive product, made it illegal for the same executives to manage two or more competing companies, a practice called interlocking directorates, and prohibited any corporation from owning stock in a competing corporation. The creation of the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, that same year provided further insurance that U.S. corporations engaging in unfair practices would be investigated by the government. Between 1880 and the early 1900s, corporate trusts proliferated in the United States, becoming powerful business forces. The vague language of the Sherman antitrust legislation and the court's reluctance to prosecute big business based on that act did little to break up the monopolistic giants. The tide turned against corporate trusts when Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, became president in September 1901, after President William McKinley, 1843 to 1901, was assassinated. Roosevelt launched a trust-busting campaign, initiating, through the Attorney General's office, some 40 lawsuits against American corporations such as American Tobacco Company, Standard Oil Company, and American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T. Government efforts to break up the monopolies were strengthened in 1914, during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. 1856 to 1924, when Congress passed the Clayton antitrust legislation and created the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, which is responsible for keeping business competition free and fair. Trust busting declined during the prosperity of the 1920s, but was again vigorously pursued in the 1930s. During the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945.
Is there a golden age of television?
Yes, people commonly refer to the 1950s as TV's golden age, which is the decade when Americans embraced television and the networks responded with the rapid expansion of programming. Critics still hail the programs of the golden age to be the most innovative programming in television history. It was during this decade that anthology programs such as Kraft Television Theater, Playhouse 90, and Studio One made live drama part of the nightly fare on primetime television. Americans could tune in to watch original screenplays such as 12 Angry Men, 1954, Visit to a Small Planet, 1955, and The Miracle Worker, 1957. And tune in they did, prompting the production of more than 30 anthology programs sponsored by the likes of Goodyear, Philco, U.S. Steel, Breck, and Schlitz, since the production work was based in New York. The anthologies drew young playwrights including Gore Vidal, Rod Serling, Arthur Miller, and A. E. Hotchner. A new group of prominent television directors and producers emerged, and the studio dramas attracted the talents of actors George C. Scott, James Dean, Paul Newman, Grace Kelly, Eva Marie Saint, Sidney Poitier, Lee Remick, and Jack Lemmon. The other cornerstone of 1950 television programming was the variety show also done live. Comedians Jack Benny, Red Skelton, Jackie Gleason, George Burns, Sid Caesar, and M.R. Television. Milton Berle thrived in the format. But the cost of producing live programs and the growing popularity of television, which created a new mass market that demanded even more programming, combined to spell the end of television's golden age. Soon, live dramas and variety shows were replaced by situation comedies, westerns, and other set-staged programs that could be taped in advance, and could be produced in quantity.
What is Proust's claim to literary fame?
Marcel Proust, 1871–1922, is generally considered the greatest French novelist of the 20th century and is credited with introducing to fiction the elements of psychological analysis, innovative treatment of time, and multiple themes. Proust is primarily known for his multi-volume work Et la recherche du temps perdu, 1954, which was published in English as Remembrance of Things Past. Proust was an creative stylist as well as shrewd social observer. In the mid-1890s, Proust joined other prominent artists, including the great French novelist of the 19th century, Émile Zola, 1840–1902, to form the protest group known as the Revisionists or Dreyfusards. The artists were staunch supporters of Alfred Dreyfus, 1859–1935. And therefore vocal critics of the French military, who they accused of anti-Semitism for keeping the French army officer wrongly accused of treason, imprisoned on Devil's Island.
Why is Napoleon still controversial?
Even history has not been able to sort out the widely disparate opinions of the diminutive French ruler. And both the detractors and the champions, or some would say the apologists, continue to publish their arguments and supporting research. The most obvious point on which scholars differ centers on the fact that, first and foremost, Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821, was a military man. Here opinion divides quite naturally. Not long after Napoleon assumed power, in the coup of 1799, he proceeded to keep France and the rest of Europe at war for more than 10 years. From the French perspective, Napoleon was a great man, a brilliant strategist who could not only muster his troops but could keep them motivated to fight one campaign after another. The targets of these campaigns: England, Russia, Austria, Germany, Spain, and Portugal among them, view Napoleon in quite a different light, as would be expected. Researchers from these countries have seen and rendered Napoleon's dark side, calling him a megalomaniac and a psychopath, and even seeing him as a forerunner of Adolf Hitler, 1889–1945. To further complicate the matter of how history views Napoleon, before he declared himself emperor for life in 1804, and launched his military conquests throughout the continent and beyond, 1805. Napoleon enjoyed a brief period in which many Europeans, not just the French, believed him to be a hero. After all, he assumed leadership of France after the hideous period of Robespierre's terror and the ineffectual government of the Directory. And then he proceeded to make peace with the Americans, the Russians, and the British. Many believed Napoleon was just the man to bring order to the chaos France had known since the storming of the Bastille. And he extended an olive branch to France's longtime enemies. It looked like he would restore order at home and abroad. Of course, this honeymoon did not last. By 1805, the leader many had looked to end the turmoil only became the cause of more turmoil. His compulsive war-making, as one writer put it, soon swept over the continent, ultimately uniting various countries in an effort to rid Europe of the scourge that was Napoleon and his Grand Army. Thus, students and readers are left to sort through the diverging accounts of this controversial figure. Napoleon has been called the Emperor of Kings, credited for his vision, insight, courage. And even with the development of the modern liberal democracy, he has also been described as a compulsive tyrant who had an insatiable appetite for battle, a man whose own ambitions left millions dead. But on a few descriptions both sides can agree, he was a brave soldier, an inspired military leader, and, at least for a time, a charismatic ruler.
How old is baseball?
Baseball, America's pastime, is more than 200 years old. According to legend, the sport's originator was U.S. Army officer Abner Doubleday. 1819 to 1893, who was credited with inventing and naming the game in 1839, while he was attending school in Cooperstown, New York, the site of the Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. But in 2004 a document was uncovered in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, citing a 1791 bylaw prohibiting the playing of baseball too close to, within 80 yards of, the town's meeting hall. Historians verified the authenticity of the document and its date. This is believed to be the earliest written record of the game, and it establishes that the stick and ball sport was being played 42 years before Doubleday's involvement. Baseball historians have long acknowledged that the sport, which is similar to the English games of cricket and rounders, had not one father, but thousands. Although the 2004 discovery indicates that the game was already in existence in 1791, and popular enough to be the subject of a town ordinance. It was in the 1800s that baseball developed into the game Americans still love today. The first baseball club, the Knickerbocker Baseball Club, was organized by American sportsman Alexander Cartwright, 1820 to 1892, in 1842 in New York City. By 1845 the team had developed a set of 20 rules, which included specifications for where the bases are positioned and how runners can be tagged as out. The rules also defined a field of play, outside of which balls are foul. The so-called New York game spread in popularity after a famous 1846 match in Hoboken, New Jersey. By 1860 there were at least 50 organized ball clubs in the country. Union soldiers helped spread the game during the American Civil War, 1861–65. And the popularity of the sport greatly increased during the last 3.5 decades of the 19th century. The first professional baseball team was the Cincinnati Red Stockings, which began play 1869. In 1876 the National League, NL, was founded. It included teams in Boston, Chicago, Cincinnati, Ohio, Hartford, Connecticut, Louisville, Kentucky, New York, Philadelphia, and St. Louis, Missouri. By the 1880s the sport had evolved into big business. An 1887 championship series between St. Louis and Detroit drew 51,000 paying spectators. The American League, AL, was formed in 1901, and 2 years later the two leagues staged a championship between their teams. In 1903, the Boston Red Sox beat the Pittsburgh Pirates in the first World Series. An overall increase in American leisure time, created by the innovation of labor-saving household devices as well as a reduction in the average laborers. Work week helped baseball become the national sport and its favorite pastime. Played on an open field, the game harkened back to the nation's agrarian roots. But with its standardized rules and reliance on statistics, it looked forward to a modern, industrialized future.
What was the first mail order company?
The mail order business was pioneered by retailer Montgomery Ward and Company. Founded in 1872 in Chicago when American merchant Aaron Montgomery Ward, 1843–1913. Set up shop over a livery stable and printed a one-sheet catalog of bargains. Midwestern farmers, hurt by low farm prices and rising costs, were a ready market for the value-priced goods, which were shipped by rail to rural customers. Originally called the Original Grange Supply House, Montgomery Ward offered 30 dry goods priced at $1 or less and provided special terms of sale for Grange members. The Grange is an association of farmers. Ward bought merchandise directly from wholesalers and, since he did not maintain a store building, overhead was low. By 1876 Ward's catalog had grown to 150 pages, in 1884 it was 240 pages and offered nearly 10,000 products, including household items, such as furniture, cutlery, and writing paper. Farm implements, such as harnesses and tools, and fashions, such as ready-made apparel and parasols. Ward offered customers satisfaction or your money back. In 1886 American Richard W. Sears, 1863–1914, entered the mail order business, opening operations in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He moved the business to Chicago the following year and sold it in 1889. In 1893 he joined with Alva C. Roebuck, 1864 to 1948, to found Sears, Roebuck and Company. The Sears catalog, which soon consisted of hundreds of pages and thousands of items, became popularly known as the Wish Book. Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck were aided by the U.S. Postal Service's expansion into remote areas. Beginning in 1896, mail could be delivered via the RFD, Rural Free Delivery. In 1913, parcel post was added to the Postal Service's offerings, further benefiting the mail order houses and their growing lists of customers. Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck offered rural America more than merchandise. The mail order houses were farm families linked to the greater consumer society that was emerging at the turn of the century. Regardless of geography, rural Americans could purchase store-bought goods. Manufactured goods that were mass-produced in factories. The mail order houses offered customers convenience, since customer purchases no longer had to be deferred for the next trip to a town. Variety, since catalogers catered to a nationwide customer base. On-hand inventory included a multitude of products, and low prices. The mail order houses bought merchandise at reduced rates from the wholesalers. Fashions were no longer restricted to the middle and upper-class city dwellers who had access to department stores. Rural customers became aware of new styles each time the Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck catalogs were delivered, which, by the early 1900s, was twice a year. Though both Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck exited the mail order business to concentrate efforts on their chain store retail operations later in the century, they set the standard for modern mail order houses through their early policies addressing merchandise returns, competitive pricing, flexible payment methods, and shipping terms.
What was the biggest gold rush?
The greatest American gold rush began on January 24, 1848, when James Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, California. Within a year, a large-scale gold rush was on. As the nearest port, the small town of San Francisco grew into a bustling city as fortune seekers arrived from around the world. Due to the influx, by 1850 California had enough people to qualify it for statehood. This pattern repeated itself elsewhere in the American West, including the Pikes Peak Gold Rush in 1859, which effectively launched the city of Denver, Colorado. The gold rush led to the discovery of copper, lead, silver, and other useful minerals. It also spawned related industry. One of the success stories is that of Levi Strauss, 1829 to 1902. A Bavarian immigrant who in 1853 began making and selling sturdy clothing to miners in San Francisco. In other countries, gold rushes had the same effect on the growth and development of regions. After the precious metal was discovered in Australia in 1851, the country's population almost tripled over the course of the next decade. The effect of an 1861 gold rush in nearby New Zealand was to double the country's population in 6 years' time. An 1886 discovery in South Africa led to the development of the city of Johannesburg. Just over a decade later, the infamous Yukon Gold Rush in the Klondike region of Canada spurred development there.
What rights are protected in the Bill of Rights?
The first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution are collectively called the Bill of Rights, which became law on December 15, 1791, and are meant to guarantee individual liberties. The First Amendment, which is perhaps most often cited by Americans, guarantees freedom of religion, speech, and the press, as well as the right to assemble peaceably and the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The Second Amendment guarantees the right to keep and bear arms, stating that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The Third Amendment forbids peacetime quartering of soldiers in private dwellings without consent of the owner. The Fourth Amendment forbids unreasonable searches and seizures. The Fifth through the Seventh Amendments establish basic standards of jurisprudence. The Fifth, which long ago fell into common usage with the phrase, "he's pleading the Fifth," guarantees that a person will not be compelled to testify against himself. The amendment also ensures that a criminal indictment can only be handed down by a grand jury. 12 to 23 people who determine if a trial is necessary, and prohibits double jeopardy, being prosecuted twice for the same criminal offense. The Sixth Amendment protects the rights of accused persons in criminal cases by guaranteeing a speedy and fair trial, an impartial jury, and the right to counsel. The Seventh Amendment guarantees trial by jury. The Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive bail, excessive fines, and cruel and unusual punishment. The Ninth Amendment, which is one that many Americans are probably unable to cite, is an important one nevertheless. It states that simply because a right is not enumerated in the Constitution, it does not mean that the people do not retain that right. The 10th Amendment relinquishes to the state governments those powers the Constitution did not expressly grant the federal government or deny the states. In other words, it limits the power of the federal government to that which is granted in the Constitution.
What was the Enlightenment?
The Enlightenment, which is also referred to as the Age of Reason, or alternately as the Age of Rationalism, was a period when European philosophers emphasized the use of reason as the best method for learning the truth. Beginning in the 1600s and lasting through the 1700s, philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, Voltaire, 1694 to 1778, and John Locke, 1632 to 1704, explored issues in education, law, and politics. They published their thoughts, issuing attacks on social injustice, religious superstition, and ignorance. Their ideas fanned the fires of the American and French revolutions in the late 1700s. Hallmarks of the Age of Reason include the idea of the universal truth, 2 plus 2 always equals 4. For example, the belief that nature is vast and complex but well ordered. The belief that humankind possesses the ability to understand the universe, the philosophy of deism, which holds that God created the world and then left it alone, and the concept of the rational will, which posits that humans make their own choices and plans, and therefore, do not have a fate thrust upon them. While the Age of Reason proved to be a flurry of intellectual activity that resulted in the publication of several encyclopedias of knowledge, toward the end of the 18th century a shift occurred. During this time Europeans began to value passion over reason, giving rise to the Romantic movement and ending the Age of Reason. This change in outlook is evident in English novelist Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. Nevertheless, the philosophies put forth during the Age of Reason were critical to the development of Western thought. The celebration of individual reason during this era was perhaps best expressed by René Descartes. 1596 to 1650, who refused to believe anything unless it could be proved. His statement, "I think, therefore I am," sums up the feelings of skeptical and rational inquiry that characterized intellectual thought during the era.
Who were the great thinkers of scholasticism?
Just as Islamic philosophers reinterpreted faith by applying reason, subordinating revelation to reason, Western philosophers endeavored to incorporate the doctrines of Greek philosophy into the theology of the Christian Church. Leaders in this movement included St. Augustine, Augustine of Hippo, Saint Anselm, and Saint Thomas Aquinas. Augustine of Hippo, 354 to 430. Lived during a time when the last vestiges of the pagan world of the Romans was giving way to Christianity. His theological works, including sermons, books, and pastoral letters, reveal a Platonic influence, foreshadowing the movement of scholasticism that emerged more than 6 centuries later, during the 11th century. Augustine believed that understanding can lead one to faith and that faith can lead a person to understanding. He also argued that Christians can understand the nature of the Trinity by examining their own nature, through introspection. One of scholasticism's founders, Anselm, c. 1033 to 1109, was a Benedictine monk who in 1093 became Archbishop of Canterbury. He became famous for writing about the attributes of God, in his work Monologion, and for trying to prove the existence of God, in Proslogion, by rational means alone. arguing that God is that of which nothing greater can be thought, that of which nothing greater can be thought must include existence. If it did not, then something greater could be thought, and therefore God necessarily exists. But the greatest figure of scholasticism was St. Thomas Aquinas, 1225–1274, who is also one of the principal saints of the Roman Catholic Church. In 1879 his philosophical works were declared the official Catholic doctrine by Pope Leo XIII, 1810–1903. While he was teaching at universities in Cologne, Germany, and Paris between 1248 and 1272, Thomas Aquinas penned his major works. Summa contra Gentiles, 1259–64, and Summa Theologica, 1266–73. He discarded the Platonic leanings of St. Augustine, to whom truth was a matter of faith, interpreting Aristotle's naturalistic philosophy. Similar to the Islamic philosopher Ibn Nasr, c. 878–950, who argued that religion and philosophy are not in conflict with each other. Thomas Aquinas believed faith and reason are in harmony with each other. His work is considered the greatest achievement of medieval philosophy, making the 13th century scholasticism's golden age. Thomas Aquinas was canonized in 1323 and was proclaimed a doctor of the Catholic Church in 1567.
Who is the Dalai Lama?
The Dalai Lama is the spiritual leader of Lamaism, a Buddhist sect in Tibet. The title, first bestowed on a Lamaist leader in 1578. Translates as teacher whose wisdom is great as the ocean. The title has been bestowed 13 times since. Followers believe that the Dalai Lama is continually reborn. Monks go in search of a young boy who was born at about the same time as the Dalai Lama died. They seek other signs of continuity as well before identifying the new Dalai Lama, who the monks educate and train to assume the leadership role.
How did ancient societies interpret catastrophic weather events?
Different cultures developed wholly unscientific explanations for dramatic weather events or other natural phenomena, explanations typically rooted in the existing mythology or folklore of its people. For example, the ancient Maya, in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula and in parts of Central America, believed that earthquakes were the gods' way of thinning out an overcrowded population. Indians in central Mexico are believed to have worshipped the grasshopper or locust after swarms destroyed their crops. One Japanese myth maintained that the entire island string rested on the back of a giant catfish, who would grow restless and flop around when the gods were displeased, resulting in an earthquake. According to Hawaiian myth, the volcano goddess Pele causes Mount Kilauea to erupt whenever she has a temper tantrum.
How old is the U.S. income tax?
It dates to 1913. Proposed in Congress on July 12, 1909, and ratified February 3, 1913. The 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution gives the federal government, specifically the U.S. Congress, authority to levy and collect income taxes. The language of the amendment states that incomes from whatever sources derived may be taxed and without regard to a census. In other words, it is up to Congress to determine the level at which citizens of the country are taxed. And this may be done without apportionment among the individual states. 100 years before the 16th Amendment was approved, Congress had begun eyeing income tax as a way to collect funds for government use. Lawmakers first considered levying an income tax to help pay for the War of 1812–14, which the new republic fought against Great Britain over shipping disputes. During the American Civil War, 1861–65, Congress imposed an income tax for the first time, charging workers and businessmen between 3 and 5% of their earnings and establishing, in 1862, a Bureau of Internal Revenue to administer the tax program. Once the war was over, income taxes were phased out. In 1894, responding to increasing economic and political pressures, the legislature again passed an income tax law. 2% on all incomes over $4,000, as part of the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act. But it was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court, which declared it unconstitutional in the case of Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Company, 1898. In the early 1900s, the idea of an income tax received widespread political support for the first time. Progressive politicians could see that the nation's wealth was poorly distributed, the gap between rich and poor growing wider. Conservative politicians worried that the government would not be able to respond to a national emergency if it lacked resources. These political factions found a single voice in favor of a graduated income tax. A tax based on level of income, those who earn more pay higher taxes. To circumvent the U.S. Supreme Court, it was necessary for Congress to propose an amendment to the Constitution. In ratifying the amendment, the states gave Congress the authority to set rates and collect income tax. Tax rates have fluctuated ever since the passage of the 16th Amendment, reaching their highest mark during World War II, 1939–45, when the rate soared to 91%. The war effort also brought the innovation of automatic withholdings. Taxes were deducted directly from paychecks. In 1953, the Bureau of Internal Revenue was dramatically reorganized to create the Internal Revenue Service, IRS. Over the decades, tax laws, collectively called the tax code, have become increasingly complex, prompting a recent movement in favor of a flat versus the graduated tax, where all taxpayers are charged at the same rate.
Who was Pythagoras?
Known by students today for the Pythagorean theorem, the square of the length of the hypotenuse of a right triangle is equal to the sum of the squares of the lengths of the other two sides. Pythagoras, c. 580 500 BC, was a Greek philosopher and mathematician who lived in the 6th century BC and whose followers kept Pythagoreanism alive into the middle of the 4th century BC. Religious in nature. Some have referred to the society as a cult. Pythagoreans believed in the functional and even mystical significance of numbers and made considerable advances in mathematics and astronomy. Pythagoras left no writings, which has prompted some scholars to believe that no such person ever existed. But rather, any doctrines ascribed to him are actually attributable to a group of people. Whatever the case, the Pythagorean legacy is real. It includes the word calculus. Pythagoreans used lines, triangles, and squares made of pebbles to represent numbers. The Latin word for pebble is calculus, the rendering of astronomy and music in numerical patterns, which were studied as mathematical subjects, and the first suggestion, as early as the 6th century BC, that Earth is spherical, not flat, and that Earth, the Moon, and the planets revolve around the Sun.
What did immigrants experience at Ellis Island?
The Ellis Island Immigration Depot was a processing center for third-class ship passengers arriving in New York Harbor. Most first and second-class passengers were processed by immigration officials on board their ships. The new arrivals were ferried from their transatlantic vessels to Ellis Island, where they disembarked and were guided in groups into registration areas in the Great Hall, a room 200 feet long and 100 feet wide. There they were questioned by government officials who determined their eligibility to land. Upon completing the registration process, newcomers were ushered into rooms where they were examined by doctors. The processing was extremely businesslike to the point of being dehumanizing. Processing typically took between 3 and 5 hours. An estimated 98% of those arriving at Ellis Island were allowed into the country. The remaining 2% were turned back for medical reasons, as U.S. health officials tried to keep out infectious diseases, or for reasons of insanity or criminal record. Other facilities at the Ellis Island Immigration Station included showers that could accommodate as many as 8,000 bathers a day, restaurants, railroad ticket offices, a laundry, and a hospital. At its peak, the Ellis Island Station processed some 5,000 immigrants and non-immigrating aliens, visitors, daily.
Why is Descartes considered the father of modern philosophy?
French mathematician and philosopher René Descartes. 1596 to 1650, was living in Holland in 1637 when he published his first major work, Discourse on Method. In this treatise, he extends mathematical methods to science and philosophy, asserting that all knowledge is the product of clear reasoning based on self-evident premises. This idea, that there are certitudes, provided the foundation for modern philosophy, which dates from the 1600s to the present. Descartes may be best known for the familiar phrase "I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum," in Latin. This assertion is based on his theory that only one thing cannot be doubted, and that is doubt itself. The next logical conclusion is that the doubter, thinker, must, therefore, exist. The correlation to the dictum "I think, therefore I am," is dualism, the doctrine that reality consists of mind and matter. Since the thinker thinks and is, he or she is both mind, idealism, and body, matter, or material. Descartes concluded that mind and body are independent of each other, and he formulated theories about how they work together. Modern philosophers have often concerned themselves with the question of dualism. Descartes' other major works include Meditations on First Philosophy, 1641, which is his most famous, and Principles of Philosophy, 1644. His philosophy became known as Cartesianism, from Cartesius, the Latin form of his name.
Of the great trio of high Renaissance artists Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael, who is considered the master?
Most historians and critics agree that it was Raphael Sanzio. 1483 to 1520, who most clearly stated the ideals of the High Renaissance. Though arch-rivals Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519, and Michelangelo Buonarroti, 1475 to 1564, influenced the younger Raphael, he developed his own style. A prolific painter, he was also a great technician whose work is characterized by a seemingly effortless grace. His most well-known work is the School of Athens, 1509 to 11. Which has been called a complete statement of the High Renaissance in its artistic form and spiritual meaning. The painting, which projects a stage-like space onto a two-dimensional surface, reconvenes the great minds of the ancient world: Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Diogenes, Euclid, for an exchange of ideas. Raphael even included himself in this gathering of greatness. But it seems only appropriate for the master to be in such company, in this work. Raphael has achieved the art of perspective, bringing the discipline of mathematics to pictorial space where human figures appear to move naturally.
What were the lasting effects of the Harlem Renaissance?
The Harlem Renaissance, 1925–35, marked the first time that white Americans, principally intellects and artists, gave serious attention to the culture of African Americans. The movement, which had by some accounts begun as early as 1917, was noted in a 1925 New York Herald Tribune article that announced, "We are on the edge, if not in the midst, of what might not improperly be called a Negro Renaissance." The first African American Rhodes Scholar, Alain Locke, 1886–1954, who was a professor of philosophy at Howard University, led and shaped the movement during which Upper Manhattan became a hotbed of creativity in the post-World War I, 1914–18, era. Not only was there a flurry activity, but there was a heightened sense of pride as well. The movement left the country with a legacy of literary works including those by Jean Toomer. His 1923 work Cain is generally considered the first work of the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes. The Negro Speaks of Rivers, 1921, The Weary Blues, 1926, County Cullen, Color, 1925, Copper Sun, 1927, Jesse R. Fawcett, novelist and editor of The Crisis, the Journal of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Or NAACP, Claude McKay, whose 1928 novel Home to Harlem evokes strong criticism from W.E.B. Du Bois and Alain Locke for its portrayal of black life, and Zora Neale Hurston. The author of the highly acclaimed 1937 novel Their Eyes Were Watching God, who was the first black woman to be honored for her creative writing with the prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship. The Harlem Renaissance was not only about literature. Jazz and blues music also flourished during the prosperous times of the post-war era. During the 1920s and 1930s, Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Morton, Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, and Josephine Baker rose to prominence. Their contributions to music performance are still felt by artists and audiences, regardless of color, today.
What did the Lusitania have to do with World War I?
World War I, 1914–18, was already underway when in May of 1915 a German U-boat sank a British passenger ship, the SS Lusitania, off the coast of Ireland. The ship had been launched in 1907 by Britain's Cunard Line to become the largest passenger ship afloat. When she was downed in the North Atlantic, 1,200 civilians, including 128 American travelers, were killed. President Woodrow Wilson, 1856–1924, warned Germany that another such incident would force the United States into entering the war. Germany heeded the warning only for a time.
What happened to Challenger?
On January 28, 1986, at Cape Canaveral, Florida, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. NASA launched the 25th mission of its Space Shuttle program. The Challenger carried a crew of 7, including Krista McAuliffe. 1948–1986, who was to be the first schoolteacher in space. She was slated to broadcast a series of lessons to school children throughout America. The crew's commander was Francis Scobie, 1939–1986, who had piloted a 1984 shuttle mission. The pilot was Michael Smith, 1945–1986, who was making his first flight in space. Mission specialists Ellison Onizuka. 1946–1986, Ronald McNair, 1950–1986, and Judith Resnick, 1949–1986, were all experienced space travelers. And payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, 1944–1986, was making his first space flight. That cold and clear January morning, the Challenger's takeoff was delayed by 2 hours. Freezing temperatures overnight had produced ice on the shuttle and launch pad, which prompted NASA to conduct inspections to assess the condition of the craft. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger was launched into space. Just 73 seconds later and at an altitude of 48,000 feet, the craft still in view of the spectators on the ground, Challenger burst into flames. While NASA controllers were aware of what had happened, they had, among other things, heard Smith utter, "Uh-oh," just 1 second prior to the explosion. It took a moment for the spectators to understand. But as the fireball grew bigger and debris scattered, the spectators, including family and friends of the crew, fell silent. The crew, inside a module that detached from the shuttle during the blow-up, evidently survived the explosion but died upon impact after a 9-mile free fall into the Atlantic Ocean. 6 weeks after the disaster, the crew module was recovered from the ocean floor. All 7 astronauts were buried with full honors. Investigations into the crash revealed that the O-rings, seals, on the shuttle's solid rocket boosters had failed to work, due to the low temperatures. The O-rings had stiffened and thereby lost their ability to act as a seal. A government commission recommended a complete redesign of the solid rocket booster joints. A review of the astronaut escape systems, to work toward achieving greater safety margins. Regulation of the rate of shuttle flights to maximize safety. And a sweeping reform of the shuttle program's management structure. The space agency retrenched. It was almost 3 years later, on September 29, 1988, before another American shuttle flew in space.
Why did the U.S. government order the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II?
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, American citizens of Japanese descent were viewed as threats to the nation's security. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt, 1882–1945, signed an executive order directing that they be moved to camps for containment for the duration of the war. More than 100,000 people, most of them from California and other West Coast states, were rounded up and ordered to live in secure camps. The action drew immediate criticism. With thousands of lives interrupted without cause, the chapter is one of the saddest in American history. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which made reparations to the victims of the Japanese internment. $20,000 was paid to internees, evacuees, and persons of Japanese ancestry who lost liberty or property because of discriminatory action by the federal government during World War II. It also established a $1.25 billion public education fund to teach children and the public about the internment period.